Thank you for attending this session, Brushing Up on Your Practice with the SANE Certification Commission. The Oregon Attorney General's Sexual Assault Task Force was established in 2001 by then Attorney General Hardy Myers as the result of a groundbreaking summit on sexual assault and systems response held in Central Oregon in 1999. The SANE program began in SATF's first year with the SANE Certification Commission, or SCC, founded by Oregon Administrative Rule soon after. But who is the SCC? This group of dedicated individuals represents a variety of disciplines engaged in sexual assault response. Their responsibility is to ensure that SANEs and SAYs in Oregon are practicing with the necessary training and qualifications to provide consistently high-level care to patients who have experienced sexual assault. Mostly, this is accomplished by reviewing SANE applications for Oregon certification or recertification, but any SANE practicing in the state can benefit from their perspectives. In this session, you will hear from 4 commission members representing the Oregon State Board of Nursing, the Crime Lab, SANE, and law enforcement about helpful tips and reminders for guiding your SANE practice.
Hi, my name is Miriam Montalvo. I am with the Oregon State Board of Nursing, and I have a specialty in forensic nursing practice. Today, I would like to talk to you about the NPA and its connection to SANE nursing. I would like to give an overview of the interactions between SANE nurses and the Nurse Practice Act, how that works together, and figuring out the competency and how to protect your license, and the importance of de-identifying charts before a review. And all of these will be related to the Nurse Practice Act as we go through this PowerPoint. The Nurse Practice Act is Oregon administrative rules that are derived from the Oregon Revised Statutes or the laws of Oregon in relation to healthcare. The NPA may seem kind of vague. People say that to me all the time. I get it. It is vague, but it is designed to give a solid form to many activities and duties that a nurse may perform as a nurse in many specialties. The NPA Division 45 standards and scope of practice for licensing practicing nurses, licensed practical nurses and registered nurses is the area of focus for this education today. And usually when I focus on it, it is conduct that adversely affects the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Nurses that fail to conform to the legal nursing standards and fails to conform to acceptable nursing standards in the profession and conduct. So I would like to talk about how the NPA and SANE nursing interconnect. Division 45, which I mentioned earlier, conduct derogatory, health and safety and the welfare of the public, and fails to conform to legal nursing standards or fails to conform to the accepted standards of nursing as a profession, and is conduct derogatory to the standard of nursing. And what this all means is, in relationship to what we know, what we've learned in school, we learn something in school, we get a job, or we go to clinical and we learn how to put in an IV, we watch and then we do it. We learn how to put in a Foley, we watch someone, we learn about it, we watch someone, and then we do it. SANE nursing, exactly the same process. So you get all educated about what it is to be a SANE nurse and what you need to do, and then of course you do SANE exams, and those exams are evaluated by your preceptor, and then you send us the application with all of this information in it. And if it is really important that when you do this, the documentation on the patient's chart, that you document specifically to all of the things that you did for your SANE exam minus the evidence that you collected. Another example is documentation and communication. And Division 45, number 4, conduct related to communication can be a failure to document nursing interventions and nursing practice implementations in a timely, accurate, thorough, and clear manner. This includes failing to document a late entry within a reasonable time period. So when I receive something that is related to a SANE case, and I've received a case of a complaint, I look at what the patient was there for. Did they say they wanted a SANE exam? When did the incident occur? Where did it occur at? What was the patient's demeanor? Were they crying? Were they laughing? Were they silent? Were they wringing their hands? Did they get a medical eval prior to you doing your SANE exam? Did an advocate get called? Did the patient want the advocate to be called? And when did the advocate get there? What type of education did you provide to the patient? Did you talk about the length of the procedure, what the procedure entails, medications for STIs, and the payment of those STI drugs, IV antibiotics, follow-up care that is specific to who they're going to follow up with medically, and when to return. If they should need to, they can always return to the emergency department. SANE nurses have an added layer of advocacy to ensure that the patient gets what they need, and you advocate for that for them, and do what's right, and document all your communication as involved as it needs to be, and make sure you get that and document the communication that you gave to other team members as well. Maintaining competency and protecting your license. The first step, I would say, is to review and understand the NPA. Read through it and be familiar with it. Review the scope of practice decision model, and it is a model that is also on the OSBN website that can show licensees, help out licensees understand their role, activities, or any interventions that is within the nurse's scope of practice, if it is appropriate for the nurse's scope of practice. Keep up with the literature and organizational policies, and refer to the Oregon SAE and SANE Commission for training and educational requirements. This becoming a SANE is a responsibility, and it takes a lot of accountability on your part to do what's necessary for public health and the nursing profession. Performing these exams is used in law enforcement investigations, and it's very important to ensure that the highest quality of a SANE exam is done. RNs who do not possess the knowledge, skills, and competency to perform these exams will prevent a successful prosecution of the perpetrator, and you don't want to be doing that. So I would review your competencies as well every year, and make sure that you are getting all of the education or the exams that you possibly can to keep your skills up. De-identifying charts is very important, of course, for all the HIPAA rules that we know of and use every day as nurses. De-identifying charts keeps info safe from for purposes of research and education, keeps info from those who need to know, and only for legal purposes. We don't want to compromise a legal investigation, and ensures privacy as well, and for related to family members, employers, friends, and related info about these people should be blocked out for privacy, so people can't put 2 and 2 together and figure out who the patient is. I would like to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed Oregon defines trauma-informed care as a strength-based framework that is grounded in the understanding of and the responsiveness to the impact of trauma. It gives an emphasis to any physical, emotional, or psychological safety issues for victims and health professionals. It gives an understanding of prevalence and scope of trauma, and trauma-informed care reduces, being aware of this can reduce triggers of past traumatic events and make the patient feel more engaged in their health care and well-being. Your organization may or may not participate in trauma-informed care. It is only needed to be advised to be aware of trauma-informed care in the response to individual patients related to their trauma and how it affects an individual that might be suffering from PTSD. It can also help reduce biases related to doing SANE exams or in any nursing diagnosis for that matter, and it can promote health and care equity. Adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care go hand in hand. These trauma or adverse childhood experiences can be anything ranging from verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse as a child. Being a refugee can be a traumatic experience. Living with family members that have mental illness can be a traumatizing experience, as well as poverty itself and food hunger can be a traumatic experience. So being aware of all of those things that can be that can have triggers is advised through Trauma-Informed Oregon. In conclusion, I would just like to remind you to learn about the NPA, at least become familiar with it, document about the patient and not the evidence you collect, keep up with the changes in forensic nursing through professional organizations such as the IAFN, Oregon Certification Commission, and RAIN, and the National Sexual Assault Resource Center to keep up with educational and new information. Take care of yourself and your patient. Take care of yourself is really important. And so I always tell people, it's not, when you're done doing a SANE exam, it is a good thing to take a debriefing on your own and gather yourself before taking care of other patients. More than 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men experience sexual assault in their lifetime, and that's really, really high. Sexual assault, as well as other violence, experience of violence, can cause lung and cardiovascular diseases, reproductive problems, GI problems, alcohol and drug abuse, risky sexual activities, mental illness, and ultimately it can cause early death. Those experiencing ACEs as young people are also at risk of becoming a perpetrator in adulthood, starting out in school as a bully and then causing intimate partner violence with their families, wives, girlfriends. And so it's very important to understand trauma-informed care.
Hi, my name is Kate Weinbrecht, and I'm the current forensic representative on the SANE Certification Commission. And today we're just going to go over the importance of documentation and legible handwriting, a brief overview and refresher on proper evidence packaging and labeling, and then also some refreshers on safe kit collection and common mistakes that we see happening that are pretty easy to prevent. So it's always good to get a refresher on. So we're going to start right out with the importance of documentation. I really cannot overstate the importance of SANE documentation in our day-to-day jobs here at the crime lab when we're processing safe kits. Your documentation, anything you can provide us, along with a police report, really is driving our analytical decisions. A few years back, we moved into what's called a direct-to-DNA methodology with our safe kit processing. And so we're no longer basing our triage decisions with safe kits off of analytical results in the lab. Rather, we're basing our triage decisions off of information provided to us in the police report and the SANE documentation. So if you're alleging ejaculation or oral contact, that information is really important to get in the police report or in the hospital paperwork that you provide us. So again, any documentation you provide is used and really appreciated. So we like to have, if possible, clear and detailed notes about the samples that are collected, in addition to any information you can provide us about the scenario or what the patient is reporting to you. We like to have the FLIF, which is that little one-page document we include in every safe kit. We like to have that completely filled out and then placed back in the kit. It's a great one-page snapshot of the questions that are most pertinent to our forensic triage of a safe kit. In addition, labeling and clear labeling and correct labeling of all swab envelopes is so important. So you want to make sure, of course, that you're collecting appropriate swabs, which we'll get into a little later, but also that you're correctly labeling the envelope and thoroughly labeling it so we know what those swabs are of and even why they were collected. And then really all of this to say that this really comes down to legible handwriting. So even if you provide us all the documentation in the world, if we can't read it, it's not super helpful. So I know it can be hard, but just a simple focus on legible handwriting can go a long way, not only in us interpreting what you've written, but also anyone downstream of us being able to read your notes that are so critical to the process. So moving on from documentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence packaging, which is so critical in evidence preservation and elimination of contamination concern. So we always want to package just one item per container. So with this, I'm talking about those other items that are peripheral to a safe kit. So things like clothing, tampons, sanitary pads, and even peripheral to that, things like bedding that you may receive or condoms that are brought in. So whatever these peripheral items are, we want to ensure that just one item is placed in each container. And further than that, we want to ensure that you're placing each item into a very breathable container. So this is generally a paper packaging material, such as paper bags or envelopes. After you've placed a single item in its own package, we want to make sure that the package gets sealed completely with evidence tape and then initialed on the outside. We want you to avoid wet glue seals, saliva, or moisture sticks. So really sealing with tape and then initialing the outside package seal. And then beyond sealing, labeling, this goes right back to that documentation, is so important. We want to make sure each package gets labeled with the patient name, what the package contains, and the location of collection of the item. So something like Jane Doe underwear collected at exam would be just perfect. So zeroing in on the safe kit packaging itself, obviously the safe kit comes self-contained and you don't need to be putting it in another brown paper bag or anything. You can just use the packaging that we've provided you, both the interior envelopes and then the exterior manila envelope provided. We want to make sure that each different set of swabs from each different body location is going into its own clearly labeled envelope. So we would never want to put, say, interior thigh swabs and external genitalia swabs in the same envelope. Each individual location of swab collection gets its own envelope. We want to make sure that all the interior swab envelopes are sealed, and it's fine to seal with evidence tape or patient labels or any other tape that you have at your disposal. You don't need to be initialing those seals, the interior seals, but if you do, that's fine. Just avoid, again, wetting the seal to seal the envelope. It's definitely preferential that you use patient labels or some other form of tape. And then again, label each swab envelope with the body location collected from, and if you know it, why can be helpful. So for something like neck swabs for possible aggressive handling. And if you don't know the why, but it's just been requested by the patient, perhaps that you collect swabs from a location, or you don't know if there was penile to oral contact, or if the why is unknown, that's fine to leave it off. But if you do know it, it could be helpful to put it on. So next we're going to go just lightly into safe kit collection and evidence preservation within the safe kit. Okay, so for the adult kit, the items that are pictured are the items that we include in each safe kit. So you'll notice there's a series of envelopes, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. There's the comb, there's some evidence tape, there's swabs, there's the ruler. The pictured items are the only items that should be going back into the safe kit. So it's okay to add additional envelopes and swabs if need be, but we really don't want you to put anything else in there, such as underwear, tampons, blood vials, microscope slides, etc. If you're collecting this peripheral evidence, it needs to be in its own packaging. For swab collection in particular, we want to make sure that you're always collecting 4 swabs for internal body locations. So this would be oral and internal genitalia. For external areas, we want you to just collect 2 swabs, generally 1 wet followed by 1 dry. What we don't want you to do is overly compartmentalize anatomical areas. We used to see this a lot more than we do now, but it's always a good refresher. A great example is we don't need you to collect right labia majora swabs and left labia majora swabs. And those 2 areas are essentially hugging. And in our world, right, we don't need to segment it out. If there is DNA where it shouldn't be, like on the external genitalia, we don't need to know that it was specifically on the left labia majora swab. Additionally, this is really not best for the evidence because you're trying to pack as much DNA onto a small amount of surface area as possible. So rather than hypersegmenting the external genitalia onto several sets of swabs, we prefer you just take 1 set, 2 swabs from the entire external genitalia. In terms of what to collect, if a victim cannot relay the circumstances of the assault, we always want you to assume that oral and penile contact is possible. So you should definitely still be collecting or considering collection or offering collection of 4 oral swabs and 4 combined vaginal cervical swabs or internal genitalia that they'll consent to, such as blind vaginal. In addition to those 2 areas, we'd like to consider collection from rectal, external genitalia, breasts, and neck. And with this list, we're really just hitting the most common areas of sexual contact. So those areas should be considered with your unknown circumstances case, because it is important to do a thorough evidence collection on those cases, even if there's not a clear report of what happened or where contact was made. In addition, we want you to be using the wet-dry swab technique for collection from all external body locations, such as those just listed. So in order to do this, you should be slightly dampening the first swab and then following that with a second dry swab. This technique has been shown to be the most effective at collecting DNA on those exterior dry surfaces. And you do not need to be labeling these swabs for us. We don't need to know which was the wet and which was the dry. So no need to waste time or effort on that. Both of the swabs will ultimately end up being sampled. I know that was a quick and brief overview, but if you guys ever have any questions, we are here across the state processing safe kits and happy to answer any questions that you may have. You can see the lab there for the phone number there for the corresponding lab in your service area.
Good morning. My name is Diane Branson. I'm a sexual assault nurse here in Oregon. I work currently on call at Salem Hospital, and where I've been a senior nurse since 2009. I also sit on the Sexual Assault Task Force as an instructor, and the Medical Forensics Committee and the SANE Certification Committee.
And my name is Nicole Broder. My pronouns are she or they. I'm the SANE coordinator at the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force. when I was first became SANE coordinator back in 2016, I was the liaison to the Medical Forensic Committee and the SANE Certification Commission. And so I'm kind of just diving back into some of those connections to help out with this presentation. I became a SANE in 2015, and I started off actually as a sexual assault advocate back in 2006. And so we're going to talk today about a couple of different things that are just helpful for SANEs to keep in mind when they're evaluating their own practice and making sure that they're doing the best job they can for their patients. So the first thing we're going to chat about is the impact of trauma and vicarious trauma on SANEs and how to diminish the impact of vicarious trauma.
I think it's important to kind of know what vicarious trauma is to start with. So it's a process of a change that occurs because we have this empathetic engagement with our patients or trauma survivors. Anybody who interacts with survivors of trauma or torture or other events that are, you know, I hate to use the word trauma in the definition, but that are traumatic or really stressful situations can affect us all. They not only affect the patient, but we kind of suck all that in with our empathy, and they can come to follow us down the road as we care, not only for that patient, but for other patients in our regular life.
And I think with that process of change too, it's so gradual that it can be difficult to pick up on, even though we do talk about it, obviously, in our profession, which is one reason why I'm so glad that you've brought this information together today, Diane, to give folks just some of those resources on how to identify and intervene with it early, because I think that's really the key.
So some of the studies I looked at it was hard to find current information. There wasn't a lot of stuff that was specific to SANE nurses, but the information I did find showed that SANE nurses are at a higher risk normally than other healthcare professionals for developing some vicarious trauma or some of the effects of having this empathetic and this trauma response. In fact, they found, one of the studies that I read said that they have found that SANE nurses, the effect of the vicarious trauma is just as significant as if they'd actually had the trauma to themselves. SANE nurses tend to report more depression, more anxiety, more substance abuse, and more burnout than other nurses that work in high stress, high volume type situations. The one article that I found that I thought had a lot of really more current information was from Forensic Nursing. And the title of the article kind of bothered me a little bit, I will admit. It's called The Emotional Challenge of Sexual Assault Nurse Examiners. And this is the part that bothered me. It said, ER nursing is stressful on a good day. Without rape victims, that title really bugged me. But anyway, I digress. This article, though, reported that 67% of the SANEs that they interviewed reported emotional burnout. They reported worrying about their victims after they left the hospital. They felt that they were just really significantly impacted by hearing some of these stories, especially over and over and over, and feeling like they saw the same thing happen to too many people. And this article was one of the few that really had more interviews just with SANE nurses and not just with healthcare people across the board.
And Diane, I'm wondering, because you've been a SANE for a pretty impressive amount of time. I mean, I know turnover with SANEs is pretty high because of some of these factors. Can you speak a little bit to how you've seen this play out in just your own experience with other SANEs, especially running a program? What's that look like over your career?
I think that is really where I started thinking about the effects of trauma. Was when I was at Salem Hospital working full-time. I was a coordinator for the sexual assault program there. And time and time again, we would see nurses leave the program, and frequently they didn't leave the program because of having to be on call. They didn't leave the program because of the pay. our hospital really supported our senior nurses well in that manner. They left because they just couldn't deal with seeing that sadness and those stories again. We tried really hard to mitigate those impacts by we had staff meetings every other month where it was a safe environment. We could talk in that group about our patients and about a case that really bothered us. It was a safe place. Nobody judged you because we all knew what we'd all seen it before. One of the things that I did was that I really encouraged all of the same nurses to feel free to call me anytime. If they needed to talk about a case or they needed to, get something, if they couldn't handle it, to give me a call. And if it turned out in the middle of a case where they realized that they were having trouble taking care of this patient because of the impact, or it was bringing back maybe some memories in their past that they had stuffed and even forgotten they had, that I encouraged them to call me, and either I could come in or somebody else could come in and either back them up or take the case for them. Because we work in a community that was not really small, but in patient load, you could easily know a patient or know who they were accusing or know their friends that came in with them. Sometimes that, we'd have that interaction too, where how do you separate, I know this person or I've taken care of them before, and I can't take care of somebody I know. As a nurse anyway, that's not really a good position to be in. But in a sexual assault, that's definitely not the position you want to be in. And so we kind of had things in place for that. We encouraged the nurses to do some fun stuff too. We tried a couple times a year at least to get together and have a potluck or a barbecue or, something along that line. We'd meet at somebody's house and just kind of let loose and talk about everything but sane nursing, because that's important too. You don't realize sometimes what you have, maybe past experiences in your life that you've had and totally forgotten about. You will forget until somebody says something and it brings that trigger, brings it back up. And just like we tell our patients, down the road, you may hear something or see something or smell something that'll remind you of this sexual assault, and that's normal. Mm-hmm. Well, the same thing can happen to a nurse. You may hear something or see something and all of a sudden have this flashback to your past that you thought you dealt with or didn't even realize you hadn't dealt with. And so this, I think what you said earlier is it's really important for us to realize the impact of our past experiences on our present life, and also our patients' past experiences on how they're dealing with what they're going through right now too.
Sane nurse can be so siloed and isolating, even the best of times. And then, of course, we're recording this like a year and a half into COVID pandemic where folks are feeling extra isolated. And I just really love that you opened up that space for the nurses in your program when you were leading that, both to debrief and then also to, get to know each other outside of just the sane perspective as well. And I'm going to use this as an opportunity also to plug the SANE technical assistance line that Patty Kenyon, our forensic nurse examiner coordinator, and I share. If you don't have a Diane in your program who you can debrief cases with, you are always welcome to use the technical assistance line for that as well. It can be uncomfortable sometimes, I think, to reach out and admit that a case was unsettling or that seeing a patient brought up certain emotions. But Patty and I would really like to support everyone through those experiences. So I'll include this in the written materials, but the number for that is 503-990-5556. We do have it on 24/7. It is staffed just by Patty and myself. So if we don't pick up right away, please leave us a message. We should be able to call you back within a few minutes, or, if we're on a case of our own, it might be a little longer, but we try to get back to folks as quickly as possible. And we want everyone to have that sense of connection and support.
So some of the signs or the symptoms that you may see in yourself or in a coworker of trauma, or you notice this feeling of loss of hope or despair, like, you know, it's not safe to do anything, you know, everybody gets hurt, or, you know, it's not safe to go for a walk at night or go run at night or go to a party where you might not know people, or just this feeling, kind of like COVID has done to a lot of people, really, of just this it's never ending kind of thing. Difficulty in maintaining professional boundaries with a patient. You know, when you start thinking, well, I'm going to give the patient my phone number so they can call me later if they need to at home, or trying to get involved in their lives, you have to keep those boundaries. Feelings of anger or rage or sadness about a patient's experience that goes on more than just the initial interaction. Sleep changes. You sleep all the time. You can't sleep at all. You go to sleep and you wake up. Overeating or undereating. Self-medicating. Nurses are at risk of self-medicating anyway. That's something that is not that uncommon in healthcare profession. So be cautious. Don't self-medicate with alcohol or other drugs to help you sleep or cope. A loss of interest in activities that you normally really enjoyed. You've always enjoyed running and now you don't want to go run. Or you've, you know, taking your dog for a walk or kayaking are things you like, and it's just like, you know, you just don't care if you go anymore. And then having difficulty in your interpersonal relationships. Our relationships with people always can have, you know, ups and downs, let's face it. But if you have just this continued disconnect with people, those are all signs that, you know, something's going on and you need to start thinking about what's going on. And hopefully you need to plan ahead for the effects of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, not try to grasp and cope in the moment. I mean, sometimes it gets ahead of us, but having a plan in place makes a big difference.
And I think just like how we talked about before, how this can be a kind of gradual and insidious process. I feel like sometimes, obviously watching out for these signs in yourself is really important, but also maybe engaging your network and your community. If you have a partner or a friend or a colleague who you trust, kind of letting them know about this kind of stuff and having them also watch out for you and sharing their feedback can help you catch this stuff sooner rather than later. So
the negative impacts from secondary trauma or vicarious trauma can really be diminished if you have a strong support system. And like Nicole just mentioned, be it a friend, a coworker, we all need a support system in our life anyway. Most of us don't do well in a total silo. SANEs tend to spontaneously do this. I mean, we know we can talk to each other in a situation, about a situation, and work through it with each other. We know the appropriate places to do that. It's not the elevator, it's not the coffee shop, but it's okay to talk with another SANE and work through a problem or a situation. Case reviews, I think, are really important. At first, I thought they were just something we had to do to nitpick a chart or nitpick care, but truly, it's not only to talk about the technical issues that came up and to get ideas from other people about how to handle it if something doesn't work for you. It's important to talk about not just the technical part of the exam, you know, how do I get this elderly patient in a position where I can get swabs? But it's also important to talk about your personal reactions to the case and what impact some of the things that maybe you heard told to you are impacting your life now. SANE nurses that have good peer support have a less chance of having a lot of impact from trauma. But other things I thought that was interesting that they found decreased the impact of trauma was job compensation. Who knew? But I guess being recognized and acknowledged for doing what you do. SANE nurses that have not more education, but are provided the opportunities for continuing education in sexual assault nursing have more job satisfaction and less burnout. And then more experienced, as nurses become more experienced, yes, they have a higher risk of the trauma, but they've developed coping mechanisms that help them decrease that burnout. That same nurses that are new to this part of nursing frequently haven't developed a toolbox to deal with what they're going through and the stories they're hearing, and don't have the emotional support and that toolbox to have skills to prevent the long-term impact.
Because we all get into this work from, this caring sense of wanting to contribute to our communities, I think it is really easy for us to be dissuaded from the sense that we do deserve to be compensated. We do deserve support and recognition. And that doesn't have to be people falling over themselves, fawning over us, but just that reminder that the trauma that we are experiencing alongside these patients is for a purpose, and that it is contributing to larger good. It's really easy to dismiss that and want to be, martyrs or just do it from the good of our hearts. But sustainability really requires it to be able to be worked into the rest of our life too, which does involve things like compensation and support at a bunch of different levels.
Definitely. And I think employers forget that sometimes, that yes, we're doing a job that technically any nurse could do. They could follow instructions and get the swabs. That's not the job. The job is the whole picture of understanding the impact to the patient and the system, and how to help them through this system, and how they can deal with each step as they go through. And our contact with that patient is frequently the first contact they have, and the first that they're telling someone other than maybe a friend what happened. And how we react and how we take care of them and how we develop that quick relationship we do with that patient makes all the difference. And so a lot of times employers don't understand that, and they go, well, we don't pay other nurses to take care of trauma patients that have been in an accident, or we don't pay other nurses extra to do, X, Y, and Z. So why should we pay you extra to do that? And it's important for us to help be able to explain to employers and to other people why it is important and what we do is important, and how it impacts not only, it impacts all of our society.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like of all the different areas of nursing that I have worked in during my career, SANE, at least for me, has been the specialty that has most embodied the holistic approach to nursing that I was really raised with, and that infused a lot of my education, because we do hit, like, I don't want to use hit, that's violent imagery, but it does cover so many different aspects of the patient's life and all those nuances.
Well, definitely, because we, a huge number of SANE nurses are ER nurses.
Mm-hmm.
And, we are the treat them and treat them mentality. We take care of them now in the moment, and you get them out. You discharge them home, you admit them to the hospital, they go to jail, whatever, but we treat and treat. And that's not what SANE nursing is. It's not that. It's that holistic care of the patient from start to finish, and possibly down the road. If a case goes to court, you see that person again, down the road. Or if you're an ER nurse, you may see that patient as an ER patient a year or two later. And I know I've had that happen where I didn't recognize them, but they recognized me. Or I will never forget the patient who came in for a sexual assault, and I'm talking to her, and her friend looks at her, and she looks at me, and her friend goes, "You were my SANE nurse, and I remember you." And she goes, "I told my friend all about you and how you helped me, and that's why she was willing to come." And it's like, wow, we do make a difference, but you don't always hear that. So that's part of this, is realizing that it is the care of the patient and what happens later too in their life. So it is important, like we talked about, to find a balance between work and play and your family and all of that, and identifying things ahead of time, things that you can do on a daily basis to help prevent it from starting. People have found that journaling, just writing down their emotions and writing down kind of the day, can make a difference. being mindful. And I know that's kind of a new age term these days about mindfulness, but being aware of where you're at every day and in your emotions and how you're dealing with just life in general. Have some rituals and routines. Do you have something that you do that brings you joy and comfort? Maybe on your way, you get called in for a case. Do you listen to some music? Do you listen to, something else? Or do you talk through your brain about how you're going to do it? And having a routine in place. I have a routine that I do with sane patients. We all, I think most of us do, but I have a routine beforehand. I think of, what I'm thinking about before I even start taking care of that patient on my way into the hospital. And then knowing when to take a break, step back and regroup. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I need to take a couple weeks off of taking call and taking care of patients, or I need to take a year off. It does, or if I even need to take an hour off, I might need just to step out of the room and regroup my own emotions. And that's okay. Patient doesn't have to know that you're stepping out because this is really bothering you. You make an excuse. I need to step out and see how that your blood test is coming, or your urine test, make sure that it's being worked on, or I need to step out and get my pen ran out of ink. I need to go get a new pen. I mean, it doesn't, they don't know that this is just a reason that you're going to step out of the room and take a break. We give them lots of breaks, but once in a while, the nurse needs one too.
Man, I really appreciate that reminder, because I feel like that's so hard for folks to really follow up on sometimes, especially given how many SANEs come from the ER background. And I think there's really this culture of toughness, at least in the ERs that I have interacted with, and among nurses in general. And I mean, and that's warranted too. We see and deal with aspects of life and trauma that many people either may never see or may rarely see. Being able to just admit that vulnerability and that need for a little bit of care and not just be the one who's doing the caring, I think can be really tough for folks sometimes.
It's okay to take care of yourself. It's totally okay. So if you're recognizing signs of vicarious trauma in your own life or in a coworker, or if you just want more information, this is one resource that I just recently found out about. I honestly don't know when this came out, but it's called Trauma Informed Oregon, or TIC. They have put out 4 self-directed modules that you can take that talk about trauma-informed care. So not just for SANE nurses, any kind of care. These modules take about 75 minutes to complete. The first one is 30 minutes, the others are 15, and it's a brief overview of a topic. It then has some interviews with people, and then a kind of a self-directed, self-checking of your some questions and answers. Talks about what is trauma-informed care. Talks about the neurobiology of trauma, resilience, and that kind of thing. So really good information. I honestly just watched them the last few days and thought, God, I would have liked to have seen these before. I think it's just important for not just SANE nurses, for just anybody. I mean, it talked a lot about just what is trauma-informed care, but also what it isn't. That it's not a past for people to abuse you, and it's not a past for people to be violent, but it's what it is and what it's not. And they're really good. Anyway, I was impressed with them.
We so often, again, think of trauma-informed care as only applying to our patients, when really we have to have that holistic lens on it and include ourselves in there as well for sustainability, but also because the only way that we could truly provide that trauma-informed care to our patients is to be aware of effects that are happening in ourselves as well, or we don't get a chance to interrupt them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too in our next slides, which are on bias. But I think especially when you are experiencing vicarious trauma or some burnout, we tend to lose some of that wider perspective that reminds us of all the things that the patient is going through and the ways that that may show up in our interactions with them. That that can be difficult. And so I definitely, I see those effects played out in the SANE patient interactions more when the SANE is not aware of how they themselves have been affected by their past experiences.
I'm going to talk a little bit about bias in healthcare, how to recognize your own biases, and then why it's important you know what these are. And even as important as the first two is eliminating ways to eliminate or decrease our bias. We all have biases and we're going to always have some, but how can we make it have the least impact in our care of our patients? What is bias? It's a prejudice in favor of or against a thing, a person, or a group when you compare them to another group. And I know that's kind of nebulous, but it's a tendency that we have to think that's preconceived about one group of society versus another. And it's usually unfair. It's not always unfair, but we're dealing more in this talking today about the unfair version. You know, the things that come to your mind when you see a patient maybe dresses a certain way or acts as, belongs to a certain ethnic group, and why this is so important that we recognize it and how it can impact our care of the patient.
The inherent fear that we can often have in regards to things that are different, or even if it's not fear, unease, or some sort of guardedness, at some point that kept our evolutionary ancestors safe. And we are at a point with our society where we can really second guess those just like survival based instincts and see all the flaws in that reasoning when it comes to creating a just and fair and connected society. Recognizing our own biases can come with a lot of shame, and I personally find shame to be counterproductive to actually learning and growing. I think understanding some of the bases for some of the parts of humanity that we're not as proud of or that aren't as useful for us can be a good way to deal with that.
It is important for us to recognize that we all have biases and why we developed them. And then how can we let them not impact us when we're taking care of people? Things kind of to think about as we go through this are, what is implicit bias or unconscious bias? How does the bias of a healthcare provider impact the care they're providing? Think about what your role is. What's your role in identifying your personal bias and also biases in your workplace? Maybe as you're thinking about this, pick a bias. How does that bias impact the care of your sexual assault patient? And how can you eliminate this? How can you reduce it so it has the least impact? And hopefully by the time we're done with all this, you'll have some tools and some ideas on how to mitigate the whole impact of your own biases on the care you're providing for this patient or any patient for that matter.
And I recognize that this topic could be hours in and of itself and still probably not do justice to it. So as Diane said, we're hoping to give you some tools with this. And then I also want to mention that one of the other pre-recorded sessions for the summit is called Unpacking Oppression in Healthcare and Other Settings. And it goes through some additional resources that the task force has developed so that you can do some assessment in your own life, in your own profession, and just to help your work align with your values. And that will be followed by a live workshop as well, if you want to do that in a safe and supportive environment too. So feel free to also look into some of those other opportunities to build up some of this knowledge and really important work.
As Nicole mentioned earlier, it starts when we're really young. When we first start interacting with society and our environment, and it actually shapes who we are today. It's a way that we developed early on to deal with everything that's coming into us. And in healthcare, when you think about it, we have to process so much information so quickly that it's a way to speed things up too. But we have to be careful because we can assume. How many times have you seen a patient assume that that female person that walked in the room that looks really young is a CNA, an aide, or the nurse, and it's actually the cardiologist or the surgeon? We all do it. I mean, patients do it all the time. we have to be really cautious. It's easy to do.
It's a shortcut for navigating the world, which our brain has so many of those, right? Because we have so much information flooding us on a daily basis that our brain has to filter through. And like Diane said, it's not malicious or evil or anything in and of itself, but it also can take over other aspects of our life or influence our behavior in ways that can then be really harmful.
So what are some of the risks? Well, bias can influence our decision-making, and it can contribute to disparity in healthcare. When things are really stressful, you're on a time crunch, we have to rapidly sort information. And by rapidly sorting this information, the biases we have can lead us down the wrong path. They can make us assume things, and that they can lead to us having less compassion. And when we're not as compassionate about a patient, we may not invest as much time or thought into the care. We take care of them. I'm not saying that you would purposely not take care of this person, but you may not build quite the therapeutic relationship you would with the patient that you identify with on a more positive note than a negative note. And that will definitely affect how you do your assessment, how you provide your care, and patients can pick this up. You may think that you're not acting that way or you're not treating them differently, but they can tell when you are maybe judging them for the way they dress or their accent or their sexual identity, that they can tell that. And equitable healthcare is a huge problem in the US. And actually, the Joint Commission, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, the Department of Health have all put in some mandates urging or requiring healthcare providers and facilities to evaluate and to address the disparities that we have in our practice. It is a huge issue, and I'm glad I'm anxious to actually hear the pre-recorded session down the road about talking about oppression, because it's all part of this.
Implicit bias and dominant culture have shaped healthcare education as well. And I think that's something that is so important to be aware of, because we can, make all the changes in our own life. And if we don't recognize where some of that stuff came from or some of the early influences on us, we may also miss some really important opportunities there.
For us to get to this non-biased thinking, it's something that we have to consciously practice. It's not going to come easy. We have to understand what our triggers are with people and then why they make us act the way we do. There's a group of tests that have been produced called the IAT, and it's a way that you can kind of self-identify your biases. And it's like 12, 14 different tests, and they help you gauge your perception on all kinds of different areas. They're not just one thing. It's interesting. I took a couple of them just to play with them and see what they're like, and it was like, oh, whoa, never thought of it that way. That you truly, it's a good way to help kind of self-identify some of those things that you may not have even thought of as a bias. And one of the slides that's coming up, and I think it might be the next one, really brought this to home with some of the terms that we use in our daily working. So we have to work together to eliminate bias. It's not just me, it's the people you work with too. So one of the terms that really hit home was using terms like those baby nurses for new grads, or drug seeker, frequent flyer. One of the things that at least ER nurses learn really quick is that we do have frequent flyer patients that come see us frequently. A lot of them have a mental health background. Well, our mental health patients that come see us frequently can also get sick. This might not be a mental health crisis. This might be a medical crisis that's totally unrelated to their mental health diagnosis. And as a SANE nurse, we have to understand that can cloud both the provider's care and my care. Sometimes a provider will say, well, I don't know if it really happened. They're kind of crazy. Well, yeah, they might be kind of crazy, and they might live on the street, and they might be hearing voices right now because they're off their medication. and they're reacting to those, but they also may have been raped. And I have to accept their story as what they're telling me is what's happened, because they're really vulnerable.
You know, I've had some sexual assault patients where it was Martians who came down with the help of the Russian government and this, that, and the other. You know, plainly, even if something happened, that's not the exact account. But one of the things I always remind myself is that is still what the patient has experienced. You know, even if I know that the Martians aren't working with the Russian government to sexually assault this patient, their fear around that, their trauma around it, their memories of that are still all really valid and all affecting them, just the way as if actual Martians were working with the Russian government. I think remembering the effects of that trauma is also so helpful.
Well, and you know, they may have just been sexually assaulted, and their protective mechanism is they went back to that part of their brain that's their process with life, and we have to understand that. So one thing you can do is think about, would I say that out loud to my patient? Now, I know we all sometimes lose our filter, but would you say, you know, to a patient that they're whiny, or they're fat, or you're just drug seeking? We would be a little more tactful, I would hope. And so think about it. If I wouldn't say that to my patient or my grandma or my mom or my dad or whoever, then think about it. Am I using some terms that are biased and judgmental? Educate yourself as to what different groups that maybe you find you have a bias toward. Educate yourself about that group of people and what they're bringing to the table. As you educate yourself about what their culture is, you come to maybe understand their behaviors and their actions and why they maybe come in this big, large, boisterous group, and understand that, so that you don't start making judgments about their behavior. This is really difficult for people, though. I mean, it's really hard to look into yourself and think, man, you know, I really was thinking in a negative way about this person or this patient. It can be painful and it can be embarrassing, like you said, and it can be hurtful to yourself too. And then look for ways to decrease stress in your workplace. Now, and I thought, when I started reading about this part, I thought, what? But high stress situations decrease our awareness of what our biases are, because we're thinking of, I got to get this, and this done. And we're not thinking of, I'm thinking of them as a drug seeker, or I'm thinking of them as a homeless patient who just wants a place to stay tonight that's warm and dry and a sandwich, and they're willing to go through all this to get that. It's important that we realize that the higher the stress situation is, the more likely we are to go back to our biased thinking, because like Nicole mentioned earlier, and we talked about earlier, that's a way to rapidly sort information quickly. We have to understand that we don't have to react to that stress. It's okay to slow down and to work through it, and not let that speed influence how we're thinking about our patient. I thought there were lots of ways you can decrease your bias. I mean, there's so much information out there besides just, you know, having someone say, hey, you know, you're thinking kind of bad there. But I thought these two were ways that you can work into your daily, your work life. This one's a little longer than the second one, but this one is the word implicit, which implicit bias is kind of what we've been talking about. So introspection, think about your own biases and identify them, and then why you might have them. Being mindful in ways to decrease stress so that you don't start reacting in that stress mode of rapid turnover kind of thinking. Perspective taking. So watch videos or read some research articles, not, you know, fluff articles, about the group that maybe you're stereotyping, and learn their point of view. Learn how where they're thinking and where they're coming from. Learn to slow down. This is a huge one for me. I'm an ER nurse. I do everything at 110 miles an hour. I rarely slow down. and I don't do well. I told Nicole before we started taping this is really hard for me because when I teach for the task force, I'm all over the room. I'm never in one spot. So this is really tough for me not to be wiggling this chair that rolls. So evaluate a person on their characteristics rather than as the group they are. Yes, they might be part of that gypsy group I talked about earlier when I first was in nursing school. But that isn't who they are. Go to them and talk to them as a person. Check your messaging. Be sure that the research you're doing is evidence-based and not just somebody's writings about their thoughts, but truly has some fact behind it. Institute fairness. Promote the change you want to see. If you want your workplace to be less biased, or your coworkers, you have to be less biased also. You have to lead the way. And then practice. Just take two. Practice, practice, practice. This is a huge change for all of us to not let our biases impact us, because we don't really, like we said in the beginning, our biases do impact what we do, and you have to be cognizant of what's going on in the back of your head and not let this affect you. It's important that we build empathetic relationships with our patients rapidly, and we're not going to do that if we're judging them.
And I think recognizing that, I mean, like you said, with practicing and all of that, that some of these steps may be slow and gradual, and that will continue to be imperfect. And so I think that balance of striving to do better and then accountability for the ways in which you're still growing or maybe still have learning is really useful.
And that's why it's important that when we see it, we call it out in a positive manner. We can't be judgmental, but just trying to, guide people toward a different thinking, because we do all get in that mindset.
Calling it out in a way that, doesn't shame, doesn't end the conversation. I always try to come back to a tenet of gentle education and inviting people to do better.
So this is one other tactic you can use. And this one is one that I used frequently, but I didn't know it had an acronym and that it actually was a way of doing it. I mean, this is just kind of how I do my patient care, especially if things are stressful. But with sexual assault patients, I have always done this before I go in the room, as I stop before I go in that room, before I meet that patient for the first time. And I slow myself down because I know I talk too fast. I know I move too fast, and they're not probably there. Some of them may want me to do this quickly, but they're not going to take in what I'm saying if I do it that way. So you take some slow, deep breaths, go to your yoga Zen place, whatever works for you, but you kind of just settle yourself and you think about what you're feeling right now. Usually when we go into a room with a sexual assault patient, we have a little bit of background. Either the primary nurse has given us a little background, or a charge nurse, or a police officer. Somebody has given us a little background that is going to influence how you go in the room and how you start interacting. So just think about that, and then kind of put that aside and just remember that you're going in to greet this patient for the first time, and don't let your feelings get in the way. And then you go in and you do your patient care and you introduce yourself. But it lets you recognize your own feelings and ground yourself so that you bring into this first encounter with this patient truly the type of person you want to be with that patient. You want to bring in that empathy and that compassion and build that relationship. You don't want to bring in all this back stuff, garbage and luggage that you already have associated. So just go in, and it gives you a chance just to ground yourself and go in and start from the beginning fresh and talk to this person that has probably had the worst day of their life or night or week before, whenever this happened to them. But they truly are in a very difficult position, and it's going to let you just greet them in the place they're at and move forward.
And it's a really good way to tie in the mindfulness that you mentioned earlier, which I think can be so hard to achieve in the hospital environment, especially. That's always where I've done my SANE exams as well. And this is such a good way to just tap into that.
the best practice of taking care of a sexual assault patient is not really different than any other patient, but it's important that we develop a really strong relationship with that patient in a rapid manner, for them to feel comfortable in telling us things that are embarrassing or hurtful or traumatizing to them. We have to be empathetic and we have to get a good therapeutic relationship going at the beginning. It's important that we provide a culturally competent, patient-centered care to this patient. And we have to understand their values and their perspectives, and we have to respect their values and their perspectives. We have to listen very carefully and with understanding and not judging. And we have to really, just as important as their physical needs is their psychosocial needs. What we do for them in the psychosocial realm is just as important as getting those swabs or giving them those antibiotics. It's meeting them in the place they're at and letting them feel safe and comfortable. We have to be really aware that beliefs about women, men, gender identity, social status, religion vary greatly among all of us. And they also vary greatly among specific groups that we've stereotyped. And we have to understand that all of our backgrounds are different and all of our thoughts are different. But I think the bottom line is this very last sentence, is that a patient whose background differs from mine still is entitled to get care that's effective and respectful of our cultural differences. And we have to value our differences, put our biases aside, and provide patients with the kind of care that ethically we want to do. We don't enter a room thinking, well, I'm just going to be rude and get this done and I don't really care. We all want to be respectful and we all want to treat people like we want to be treated. And that's the bottom line, is put your bias aside, recognize that we all have them, and then respect the patient and their differences from us, because we can all learn from each other. So I found this statement, and it's from the Code of Ethics for Nurses. And I thought it kind of summed up the whole thing. And it kind of sums up our whole practice as a nurse, not just a sane nurse. The nurse practices with compassion and respect for the inherent dignity, worth, and unique attributes of every person. I don't have to like what they may have chosen to do in a situation, but we're all unique, we're all worthwhile, and we all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect.
Good morning. My name is Susan Lehman. I'm the Sexual Assault Program Coordinator for the Portland Police Bureau. And today we're going to be talking about how to approach a sworn police officer about something that may have gone wrong during the sexual assault exam from your eyes as a sane nurse. First of all, I want to say that, most police officers want to be helpful. They want to do the right thing. So if they come to an exam and they're not their best self, and you would like to talk to them or pull them aside, or even talk at a later time, talk to their supervisor about the interaction, that is 100% appropriate. Police agencies in this day and age want their police officers to be polite to the public. They want their police officers to be the forward-facing, trauma-informed officers that we all expect to respond to a sexual assault. However, in most jurisdictions, unless an officer is assigned to a really high crime area, they're only going to get a few sexual assaults during the year, like 1 or 2 maybe. And so they are just as nervous and awkward sometimes about interviewing a victim or talking to a sane nurse as the public is talking to an officer that's looming over them as they're laying in a hospital bed, that has a radio on their hip and a gun on their side. I mean, to me, that is just very intimidating as an individual. It's not like they have a choice. They can't take off that part of their equipment. but they are just as nervous to talk about these things with a victim because they just don't do it very often. So I think SANE nurses can help officers with some direct talk and some helpful hints when things don't go as they should. Well, I think just being honest with someone about the reaction that you're seeing, as we would like to do with, all individuals, by saying, I see you're upset about that, or I see that you're uncomfortable with the situation. Is there anything I can do to help? Maybe you don't clearly understand the situation correctly, or in cases of people with mental illness, just talking about these are regular behaviors that we see with people with this diagnosis. And hopefully that will lead to a productive conversation and reset the officer with what he needs to do at that moment. Well, I think there are two questions really here. One, sometimes officers have to ask a hard question that they prefer not to have to ask. Mm-hmm. And it can seem to an observer that that question is kind of overstepping. But the officer may have other information that hasn't been presented to the SANE nurse. The other thing is, that we're all learning every day. And although Portland Police is doing a new education campaign on sexual assault investigations and being trauma informed and how to ask the right questions, that starts, I think, next month. I think most people, if the nurse has the opportunity and can do it in privacy, can just say to the officer, I heard the question about the size of the person's genitalia. And a better way to phrase that, or a better way to ask that, like we would do in the medical field, would be XYZ. Now, we certainly have cases where suspects have unique attributes to their genitalia, and the officer has to ask that question, right? They may have unusual markings or piercings, or the general aesthetic of the genitalia is not of normal anatomy. I think if we take the assumption that the officer is not informed about the anonymous reporting law in Oregon, the first thing is to point that out to them. The victims have a right to an exam that's paid for by the state of Oregon, but they don't have to report to police. That's their right, or they can report at a later time. And it can be a truly anonymous kit, or in Oregon, we also have kits that are covered under Melissa's law. So the officer may come and the victim may give her statistical information, her name and date of birth, and then as she starts to tell the story, can't do it, right? She's just too upset. So the story doesn't necessarily get documented in the police report. She asks the officer to leave. A lot of officers, I think, feel like they need to maybe take a second run at it just to make sure she doesn't want them there. I'm not, that's a case-by-case situation that can be very hard on the victim to come in a second time, but it also, if there's been space and time, maybe the victim has been able to collect themselves and then can give their report to the officer. So if they decide not to give their report, but the officer already currently has their name and date of birth on the police report, Melissa's law in Oregon prevents police agencies from sending those to the crime lab. So there is kind of a double tier to reports that go to the crime lab. So in each case, the victim would need to come back to the police agency and make a proper report. In the case of an anonymous survivor. Of course, they need to make the initial police report. And in the case of someone that falls under Melissa's law, they would have to contact the police agency and give their story. Because of the size of state we are, so like the Portland metro area, down the valley, Eugene, Corvallis, they're going to have a separate detective division. And within that detective division, depending on how big it is, the detective division may be divided into person crimes and property crimes. So I would start there. I would start just looking on the website to see, you know, does Salem PD have a detective division? Yes, they do. Oh, they have a person's crime, or they may even actually have a sexual assault unit. And generally the number that's listed will either be to the admin person in that unit or to the sergeant. And I think it's important, you know, when we see a constant gap in knowledge for officers, that we do reach out to those supervisors and say, you know, I just want you to know this has been a consistent theme. Is there something we can help with training? Can we maybe get, you know, the SATF involved to see if we can have some training for your officers? Or I know of this other agency that does some training. But it, you know, I personally have seen this problem on more than one occasion. And, you know, most supervisors want, even though they may not supervise the street officer directly, they want the best outcome, right? Because when a victim is treated well, feels heard, feels nurtured, feels like the interaction with police officers went well, that makes the detective's job even easier because they have a good rapport with the police agency. So there's some benefit for the detective supervisor to fix the problem that you're addressing. Now, if it's a smaller agency and they may have one detective, or even in very small agencies, the individual street officer takes on the role of the investigator as well. Depending on how big that agency is, I know there's some agencies in Oregon that just have 2 or 3 officers. And you would just call the sheriff or the police chief in that instance, and let them know. And again, you know, like with everything, we want to approach these things with grace, right? If there's a lack of knowledge, what we want to do is make sure that, you know, we're presenting it as a lack of knowledge, and how can we help? That takes anybody right off the defensive. And that's the kind of interaction we want, whether it's, you know, when you're talking to a survivor about, you know, how the criminal justice system works, or even how, you know, the healthcare system works. We live and breathe the criminal justice system. You live and breathe the healthcare system. I have certain ideas about how the healthcare system should work, which I'm sure are wrong, as many people have views and opinions on how criminal justice system works. So, you know, it's all a team effort, right? We're all here for one reason, and that's so the survivors feels valued, they feel heard, they feel comforted, and that they feel that they have the right to make the decision in what happens next, right? Either in their healthcare or in their police report. And that's what we all want in the end. That is so important, right? That everybody gets to the table, so that as issues start to occur, or just general questions start to come up, that they can be addressed in a timely manner. Mm-hmm. Because if they're not addressed in a timely manner, either the problem persists, or the person with the original question feels like they're not being heard. Nobody cares about what they have to say or the question that they had. And we certainly you know, as a society, don't want that to happen. You know, we want people to have the information that they need to do their jobs and to make appropriate decisions. Well, one thing I would like to talk about as being the KIT coordinator here in Portland is the importance of using the new statewide tracking system. So it starts with the nurses. They are ground zero. So if a nurse, for one reason or another, can't or didn't input a KIT, that's one opportunity for a KIT to slip through the cracks, right? So let's take worst case scenario. Nurse A has a very busy night. She's going from one exam to the other, and she forgets to put one of the exams in the statewide tracking system. Then again, and then Officer Smith comes, picks up the KIT, picks up 2 KITs, let's say, and from the same hospital, puts them in his trunk. Then he gets called on to another call. And now all of a sudden it's the end of his shift. Things have jostled around in his truck or the trunk of the car. And now one KIT is now obscured from his view. And all he remembers is going to the hospital and picking up a KIT. Well, there's a KIT, so he takes it out of his trunk, right? So if that KIT that's out of his view is the one that wasn't entered to the statewide system, no one's going to know it's in his trunk probably for days or weeks, because it may not get noticed, right? And so then it doesn't alert the police agency that I have a missing KIT and I need to figure out where it is. So it's important that we all do our part, and it starts with the nurses, it continues with the police officers, and then it continues with the agencies who send them into the crime lab. So everybody does a little bit, and hopefully we don't miss any KITs that way. But I can tell you here at Portland Police, at least once a month, I'm looking for a KIT. Either because the officer just put the wrong case number on it, which happens, they reverse the numbers, or the original call number didn't get forwarded to the police officer picking it up, or a few months ago we had one that was left up at OHSU and nobody knew that it was in the evidence locker. Nobody wants that. But I knew that there was a KIT because the nurse put it into the statewide tracking system. It's just that nobody went and got it. It was one of those nights, where there was a shooting in Portland, and so there just wasn't anybody available to go pick it up. And then, shift change, and then it just gets forgotten. So that's why it's so important for the nurses and everybody else who touches a sexual assault KIT to do their part and enter it into the statewide system. So, and if, say nurses or other law enforcement personnel have issues with SamTrack, please be sure and email the SamTrack feedback email, so those can be taken care of.